At 2:17 a.m., something exploded in a small port city, yet no windows shattered, no alarms rang, and no one was hurt. There were no witnesses, no headlines, no questions. Only one place in the world noticed. A classified CIA system recorded a sudden surge of energy, and then silence. Days later, a CIA agent arrived in the city and found something far more disturbing than destruction. The city hadn't denied the event. It had simply forgotten it. And somewhere in that quiet, a truth waited, never asking to be exposed. The night Valenport forgot itself, the weather was calm in a way that felt almost deliberate. A soft maritime wind drifted in from the harbor, carrying the smell of salt and old iron, brushing gently against the stone facades of buildings that had stood for centuries. The ancient port city lay folded into sleep, its narrow streets slick with moisture, its lights dimmed but steady, as if the town trusted the night not to betray it. Valenport was old in the quiet way of places that had learned survival through endurance rather than resistance. History did not announce itself here. It lingered. At exactly under 2:17 a.m., something occurred that should have altered that history, and somehow did not. No one stood awake and alert enough to witness it directly. No single voice would later rise with certainty and say, "This is what I saw." There was no clear sound to mark the moment, no violent rupture of air, no cascade of breaking glass. What happened resembled an explosion only in outline, stripped of every consequence that normally followed such an event. For a brief instant, the city seemed to tighten around itself. A pressure passed through Valenport like a held breath, subtle enough to avoid alarm, strong enough to leave a faint trace in the bodies of those asleep. A few people shifted in their beds. A few later recalled a fleeting discomfort they could not explain. In the old quarter, a street lamp flickered once, then steadied, as if embarrassed by its own reaction. Near the docks, a ship's hull groaned softly, a sound indistinguishable from any other night. And then the moment withdrew, leaving no echo behind. By 2:18 a.m., Valenport was whole. Nothing burned. Nothing lay broken. The city returned to its rhythm without hesitation, unaware that anything worth noting had passed through it. When morning came, it brought no urgency. Shop owners unlocked their doors, fishermen prepared their nets, commuters complained about the weather and the slow traffic. No emergency calls had been logged. No streets were sealed. The local papers carried their usual stories, and the international press found nothing worth reporting. What made the event remarkable was not the lack of damage, but the lack of memory. Valenport did not deny the night. It simply had nothing to say about it. Far from the harbor and its quiet streets, the night was not forgotten. High above the earth, surveillance satellites registered a brief anomaly over the city's coordinates. For a fraction of a second, instruments detected a sharp spike of energy, isolated, intense, and incompatible with known patterns. It appeared suddenly, reached a measurable peak, and vanished without decay or aftershock. No atmospheric disturbance followed. No secondary signals emerged. The anomaly behaved as if it had never intended to stay. Analysts reviewed the data in rooms designed for certainty rather than curiosity. They compared it against decades of records, natural phenomena, classified tests, known signatures of human activity. Nothing matched. The event resisted categorization and, in doing so, invited the simplest institutional response. In a classified CIA file, the incident was reduced to a single, emotionless line. Cause undetermined, phenomenon concluded. The wording implied closure. It did not invite questions. It was that refusal which drew the attention of Ethan Cole. Ethan Cole was a CIA field operative known not for spectacle, but for restraint. In his early 40s, he was tall and lean, with movements shaped by discipline rather than haste. His dark hair was carefully kept, his face composed in a way that revealed little and observed much. He favored impeccably tailored suits, worn not for display, but for control, structure imposed upon uncertainty. Colleagues described him as calm, methodical, and difficult to unsettle. Few spoke openly about the incident early in his career that had shaped him, a mission where an accepted conclusion had concealed a critical truth and lives had been lost because no one had looked closer. Ethan read the Valenport file late at night, under artificial light and institutional silence. He read it once, then again. The phrase, "phenomenon concluded," unsettled him. It felt less like an ending and more like a decision not to look further. Within hours, he requested assignment to Valenport. The request was approved without comment. When Ethan arrived, the city did not react to him. There was no visible increase in security, no sense of vigilance or fear. He moved through the small airport unnoticed, dressed in a dark suit that allowed him to blend into the background. Outside, the air was cool and damp, the sky low and gray. The harbor wind carried familiar smells of salt and fuel. Valenport welcomed him with indifference. As he moved through the city, Ethan observed carefully. Buildings stood intact, windows were unbroken, streets showed no sign of disruption. Life continued with habitual confidence. Yet beneath that normalcy, he sensed something amiss. When he asked about the night of the incident, responses were hesitant and imprecise. People searched their memories and found impressions rather than events. A restless sleep, an odd dream, a moment of unease with no origin. No fear lingered in their voices, and uncertainty dissolved quickly, as though the city resisted holding on to the thought. Standing by the harbor as evening approached again, Ethan looked out over the water. Lights shimmered across the surface, long and unbroken. Somewhere beneath that calm exterior, at exactly 02:17 a.m., reality had briefly misbehaved. Satellites had noticed, systems had recorded it, but the city itself had let it pass without keeping a trace. Ethan understood then that the absence of evidence was not a failure of observation. It was the defining feature of the event. Valenport had not been spared destruction. It had been spared memory. The city did not deny that something had happened. It simply could not remember it. And that quiet inability, Ethan knew, marked the true beginning of the case. Samuel Reed had learned to live quietly long before silence learned to notice him. His house sat on a narrow side street a few blocks from Valenport's harbor, wedged between buildings that leaned toward one another like tired old men sharing secrets. The paint on his shutters had faded unevenly from years of salt air, and the small brass numbers on his door had been polished smooth by time rather than care. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust, warm metal, and the comforting residue of habits repeated for decades. Samuel was 71 years old, thin to the point of seeming fragile, with shoulders slightly rounded from a lifetime spent leaning over workbenches. His hair, once dark, had retreated into a soft gray halo, and his hands bore the quiet tremor of age. Not weakness, but accumulated precision. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though the world might break if he hurried. Samuel spoke little to his neighbors, and less to strangers, not from unkindness, but from a careful economy of emotion shaped by years of loss. His wife had died suddenly 12 years earlier, and with her went his appetite for unnecessary conversation. Since then, he had found companionship in machines, which asked only to be understood, and in Copper, who asked for nothing except warmth and food. Copper was an aging orange tabby, perhaps 10 years old, with a torn left ear and eyes the color of old amber. His fur had begun to thin along the spine, but his dignity remained intact. He followed Samuel from room to room like a silent supervisor, judging workmanship with slow blinks and an occasional flick of the tail. On the night of 02:17, Samuel had not been asleep. He rarely was at that hour. Insomnia had become a familiar visitor after retirement, bringing with it long stretches of thought and quiet experimentation. His workshop occupied what had once been a dining room, its walls lined with shelves of components scavenged from flea markets and forgotten warehouses. Old radios rested beside newer instruments, their dials and antennas bearing the marks of different eras trying to coexist. At the center stood Samuel's workbench, scarred by solder burns and etched with pencil marks only he understood. That night, he had been reviewing a set of diagrams copied decades earlier from declassified Cold War research, documents he had first encountered as a young engineer, back when theory still felt like promise rather than temptation. He had never intended to build anything dangerous. His interest was purely academic, an attempt to explore how overlapping frequencies might briefly cancel one another under precise conditions. To Samuel, it was an elegant idea, a mathematical curiosity that belonged on paper, not in the real world. Copper lay curled on a chair nearby, eyes half closed, tail twitching lazily. At exactly 02:17 a.m., the air in the room changed. There was no sound to announce it, no vibration, no flash of light. What Samuel experienced instead was the sudden absence of everything he had grown accustomed to hearing. The faint electrical hum that had always lived in the walls vanished. The subtle hiss of static from powered equipment disappeared. Even the distant noise of the harbor, so constant it had long ago faded into background, fell away. It was as if the universe had drawn a curtain over itself. Samuel froze, one hand hovering above the bench, breath caught halfway in his chest. Copper lifted his head sharply, ears flattening, eyes wide and alert. The silence was not empty. It had weight. It pressed against Samuel's ears and chest, not painfully, but insistently, like water at depth. For a single, disorienting instant, Samuel felt exposed, as though something vast and impersonal had noticed him in return. Then, just as abruptly, the world resumed. The hum returned. The distant harbor sounds drifted back into place. Copper shook himself once, offended, and settled again. The entire experience lasted less than a second, yet it left Samuel standing in his workshop with a chill creeping up his spine. He looked down at the device on his bench. It was unremarkable in appearance, a compact assembly of coils, copper wiring, and salvaged components mounted on a metal plate. A small indicator light glowed briefly, then went dark. Samuel knew, with a clarity that bordered on fear, that he had not switched it on. It had activated on its own and shut itself down just as decisively. He reached out, fingers trembling now, and unplugged the unit from the wall. His heart pounded harder than the moment seemed to justify. He waited for alarms, for sirens, for the knock of authority at his door. None came. Minutes passed. The city outside remained indifferent. Samuel sat heavily on a stool, Copper jumping down to circle his legs before settling against his ankle, warm and solid. The cat's presence grounded him, reminding him that whatever had occurred, the room was still real. Samuel checked the time. 02:19 a.m. He listened. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. By morning, Samuel expected questions. He rehearsed explanations he might offer if authorities arrived. He prepared himself for accusations he did not believe he deserved. When daylight came, it brought nothing but routine. No officials. No inquiries. The radio in the kitchen played its usual programs without interruption. Outside, neighbors greeted one another with sleepy familiarity. As the day wore on, Samuel realized that whatever had happened at 2:17 had left no footprint. Anyone else seemed able or willing to follow. The absence of response unsettled him more than confrontation would have. For the first time since his wife's death, Samuel felt truly alone with something he could not share. That evening, he dismantled the device piece by piece, hands steady now, mind racing. He did not destroy the components. He cataloged them, labeled them, and locked them away. Copper watched from the doorway, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, eyes never leaving Samuel. When the last screw was removed, Samuel leaned back and exhaled. He had touched something that night, something vast and indifferent, and been allowed to walk away unnoticed. That knowledge did not comfort him. It weighed on him. As darkness returned to Valenport, Samuel sat in his quiet house, listening carefully to a world that had resumed its noise as though nothing had happened, wondering how long silence could remember a man when the world had already forgotten. By the third day in Valenport, Ethan Cole understood that the city was not hiding anything from him. It simply did not believe there was anything to hide. Morning arrived with the same patient rhythm it always had, light sliding over stone walls and narrow streets, the harbor breathing in slow, familiar cycles. The weather was mild, the sky pale and stretched thin above the rooftops, carrying the quiet confidence of a place that had already decided it was safe. For an investigator trained to read disruption, Valenport offered none. No physical damage marked the city. No broken windows waited to be photographed. No repairs were underway. There were no emergency meetings, no whispered rumors thick enough to cling to. What unsettled Ethan was not what he saw, but what he could not provoke. He began methodically, walking rather than driving, letting his presence dissolve into the background. He spoke first with dock workers, men whose lives were shaped by tides and repetition. One of them, broad-shouldered and weathered, described a fleeting sensation on the night in question. A mild vibration in his chest, like standing too close to a running engine. He laughed it off almost immediately. Another man insisted he had slept uninterrupted through the night and remembered nothing unusual at all. Neither reaction carried fear. Ethan moved inland, stopping at small shops, cafes, and residential buildings. He spoke with retirees, students, parents pushing strollers along streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Their answers did not align. A woman in her 60s said she had slept better than she had in years. A young man recalled waking suddenly with his heart racing, then drifting back to sleep without explanation. Others frowned, searching their memories and finding nothing at all. What struck Ethan most was how quickly uncertainty dissolved. No one lingered on the question. No one demanded clarity. The absence of a shared memory did not trouble them. It seemed to fade as soon as it appeared. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned to the small cafe near the harbor. Behind the counter stood Sarah Whitman, wiping down the surface with practiced ease. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slender, her posture suggesting a woman accustomed to standing on her own. Her brown hair, threaded with premature silver, was tied back neatly, and her eyes carried a calm attentiveness shaped by experience. Years earlier, a sudden divorce and the collapse of a carefully constructed life in the United States had driven her abroad. Valenport had offered her anonymity without isolation, and over time she had learned to be warm without becoming vulnerable. She greeted Ethan politely, recognizing him without curiosity. When he asked again about the night of 02/17, Sarah paused longer than before. She said she remembered waking briefly, feeling an unusual calm, then falling back asleep. Like forgetting something important before you even knew what it was, she said, almost apologetically. Moments later, she shrugged and returned to her routine, the thought already slipping away. By evening, Ethan had crossed nearly the entire city. There was still no sign of collective concern, no social ripple that followed the event. The absence felt deliberate, though no one had chosen it consciously. Alone in his hotel room, Ethan reviewed his notes. Each account differed in detail, but they shared a common trait: emotional neutrality. Whatever had happened at 02/17 had not frightened anyone, and fear, Ethan knew, was the anchor of memory. Without it, recollections drifted, unmoored and easily discarded. He stopped looking for damage and began looking for patterns that did not belong. The satellite data replayed silently on his tablet, the sharp energy spike frozen into abstraction. The anomaly had not spread outward. It had not triggered secondary effects. It had appeared, peaked, and withdrawn, as though constrained by intention rather than chaos. Ethan cross-referenced the timestamp with municipal records, power usage graphs, and electromagnetic readings. Most returned flat and unremarkable. But one trace, a faint irregularity in radio frequency activity, stood out. It was localized, brief, and easily overlooked, yet its timing aligned precisely with the anomaly's peak. As dusk settled, Ethan returned to the street identified by the data. The block was unremarkable, lined with aging buildings and small businesses surviving more by habit than prosperity. Near the end stood a narrow storefront with a faded sign advertising radio repair. The display window was dusty, filled with analog equipment that belonged to another era. Ethan paused across the street. Inside, an elderly man moved slowly among the shelves, his posture careful, his motions deliberate. He was thin, slightly stooped, dressed plainly, handling the objects around him with quiet respect. There was no urgency in his movements, no sign of fear. A cat appeared briefly in the window, orange fur catching the light, eyes alert and steady. Ethan felt no immediate certainty, only focus. This was not a criminal profile, not yet. But it was the only place in Valenport where measurable technical activity coincided with the moment the world had briefly misaligned. As night fell, Ethan chose patience. He watched until the shop lights dimmed and the street returned to its low evening murmur. The city, without questions, had absorbed the anomaly and moved on. But it had left one trace behind, and that trace had led him here. Ethan Cole did not enter Samuel Reed's shop with the posture of an interrogator. There was no tension in his shoulders, no urgency in his step. He arrived the way one arrived at a place already understood, letting the bell above the door announce him without ceremony. The sound was thin, almost apologetic, and it faded quickly into the familiar hush of the room. The shop looked unchanged from the outside, but inside it carried the quiet weight of recent decisions. Shelves crowded with radios and components lined the walls, their surfaces dulled by age and careful use. The air held the faint scent of warm metal and dust disturbed too often to fully settle. Samuel stood near the workbench, his back slightly bent, hands resting still as if they had learned that motion was no longer required. He did not appear surprised to see Ethan. Samuel turned slowly, his expression composed, neither defensive nor relieved. The lines in his face spoke of restraint rather than exhaustion, of a man accustomed to holding questions without demanding answers. Copper lay on a folded cloth near the window, orange fur catching the late afternoon light. The cat opened one eye, assessed Ethan briefly, then closed it again, satisfied that no immediate threat had entered the room. Ethan did not ask Samuel to sit. He did not introduce himself again. He spoke softly, stating observations instead of accusations, letting each sentence settle before continuing. Samuel listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his breathing even. When the silence stretched long enough, Samuel nodded once. "Yes," he said. Nothing more was needed. He explained without embellishment. The device had never been designed as a weapon. There was no intention to disrupt the city, no thought of impact beyond theory. It was an attempt to answer a question that had followed him for most of his life. A question born in classrooms and laboratories where curiosity was permitted to exist without consequence. He had wondered whether time and reality, often treated as immovable structures, might briefly compress without breaking. Not to change them, not to control them, only to understand whether such compression was possible at all. Samuel spoke of precision, of margins small enough to vanish if handled carelessly. He admitted that the activation had not been deliberate. When the silence arrived, when the world withdrew into itself for that brief, immeasurable instant, fear had come not from what he had achieved, but from what he could not predict. He had felt then that understanding did not grant ownership. It only revealed responsibility. Ethan listened, his expression unreadable. He had heard similar explanations before, from men far less restrained, far more convinced of their own necessity. What distinguished Samuel was not innocence, but humility. There was no pride in his voice, no insistence that the world should care what he had touched, only acceptance. Ethan understood the shape of the truth well enough to recognize its danger. If he reported the details as they were, Samuel would disappear into a system designed to contain anomalies, not people. His name would be reduced to a reference number. His work would be dissected by others who had not asked the question for its own sake. The city would gain an explanation it did not want, and Samuel would lose a life that no longer belonged to him. Ethan chose a different ending. He told Samuel what would be written. The report would describe the event as a spontaneous phenomenon, brief, localized, non-replicable. It would emphasize the absence of physical damage, the lack of residual effects, the conclusion already accepted by higher levels. There would be no mention of a device, no identification of an individual. The file would close itself with a language that discouraged further attention. Samuel did not respond immediately. He looked around the shop, at the radios waiting to be repaired, at the tools arranged with habitual care. Copper lifted his head and rose, stretching slowly before moving to Samuel's side. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "That means it ends here," he said. Ethan nodded. Samuel accepted this without argument. Recognition had never been his goal. He understood the cost of silence and chose it deliberately. Whatever he had built, whatever question he had briefly touched, would remain unfinished. Not because it was wrong, but because the world had no safe place for it. That evening, Samuel dismantled what remained of the device. He worked methodically, separating components, loosening connections, returning each piece to anonymity. Ethan observed without interference, noting the care in every movement. This was not destruction, it was restraint. Copper supervised from a nearby chair, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, rising only to inspect progress before settling again. The cat's presence grounded the room, a reminder that life continued even as meaning was carefully set aside. When the last component was removed, the workshop felt lighter, as though something unseen had been released. Samuel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to suggest finality. Nothing more needed to be said. Ethan left as he had entered, without ceremony. Outside, the street remained calm, unchanged by the truth it concealed. Valenport continued to move forward, indifferent and intact. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Ethan wrote the report. He chose each word carefully, smoothing edges, closing paths before curiosity could follow them. When he sent it, there was no sense of victory, only the quiet certainty that some truths did more harm when exposed than when allowed to rest. By morning, the city remained as it had been. Samuel reopened his shop. Radios played again. Copper reclaimed his window. And the truth, unspoken and unclaimed, settled into silence, exactly where it could no longer wound anyone. Valenport did not announce its return to normalcy because it never admitted that it had left it. The days following the quiet conclusion unfolded with the same patient rhythm that had defined the city for generations. Morning light slid across stone walls and harbor water. Gulls traced familiar paths through the air, and the narrow streets filled with footsteps that knew exactly where they were going. No one gathered to remember. No one argued over what had happened. The city, ancient and practiced in survival, chose motion over explanation and found comfort in the decision. Whatever pause had touched it did not linger long enough to demand a story. In the small radio shop near the older quarter, Samuel Reed turned the sign on his door from closed to open and felt the modest satisfaction of routine returning to its place. The bell rang as it always had, thin and unobtrusive, a sound that belonged to another time. Inside, the shelves remained crowded with analog radios, their dials and faces worn smooth by hands that trusted them more than newer devices. Samuel moved behind the counter with the same deliberate care he had always shown, his posture familiar, his gestures unhurried. The workbench was cleared of anything that did not belong to repair. What had once rested there as possibility now existed only as memory, neatly set aside. Copper reclaimed his position near the window, orange fur warmed by sunlight, eyes half-lidded in contentment. He was no longer alert for interruption. His kingdom, once briefly unsettled, had returned to balance. Customers arrived throughout the day, drawn not by urgency, but by habit. A retired dock worker brought in a shortwave radio that had belonged to his father. A young woman asked if an old receiver could be coaxed back to life for her grandmother. Samuel listened, nodded, and worked. His hands moved with quiet confidence, soldering connections, adjusting frequencies, restoring voices long thought lost. He did not speak of theory. He did not speak of silence. The questions that had once followed him retreated into the background, where they could no longer demand answers. In their place was the simple, grounding certainty that something broken could be made whole without consequence. Across the city, Sarah Whitman wiped down the counter of her cafe as the afternoon crowd thinned. She moved with the same practiced efficiency that had carried her through years of starting over, tall and slender, her presence calm and reassuring. Regulars greeted her by name, and she responded with the measured warmth of someone who had learned how much of herself to give without regret. She did not think about the night of 2/17. When the thought brushed past her, it found no place to settle. There was comfort in that. Valenport had given her what she needed most after loss, the freedom to exist without explanation. Ethan Cole watched the city one last time from a distance that felt appropriate. He did not seek out Samuel again. He did not return to the cafe. His work here was finished, and he understood that staying longer would only risk disturbing what had been carefully allowed to rest. He packed his belongings with methodical restraint, folding his clothes with the same precision he applied to reports and decisions. There was no ceremony in departure, no farewell tour of streets that had never truly acknowledged him. At the airport, Valenport let him pass without recognition, as it let most things pass. On the flight home, Ethan reviewed the final report once more. It remained exactly as he had written it, untouched by revision or inquiry. In the archives of the CIA, the file occupied little space and attracted less attention. Its language was efficient, conclusive, and intentionally uninviting. Cause undetermined, phenomenon concluded. The system accepted this readily. It always preferred endings that required no further investment. Ethan understood how rare that acceptance was. In another version of events, one shaped by fear or ambition, the outcome would have been different. Names would have been recorded. Lives would have been redirected. Silence would have been treated as a challenge rather than a boundary. As the plane lifted through cloud cover, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection he would not have admitted to anyone else. He thought of the missions that had defined his career, operations measured in targets neutralized and threats contained. Those outcomes had been clear, their consequences immediate. This one was different. There had been no weapon to confiscate, no suspect to detain, no victory to claim. And yet, the absence of those actions felt deliberate, even necessary. He recognized that restraint was not weakness. It was, at times, the most precise response available. Back in Valenport, evening settled gently over the harbor. The lights reflected across the water in long, steady lines. Samuel closed his shop at the usual hour, turning the sign and locking the door with practiced ease. Copper followed him home, tail high, unconcerned by the world beyond their shared routine. The house welcomed them with familiar silence, no longer heavy, no longer charged, just quiet. The city continued to move, unburdened by explanation. Children played in narrow streets. Boats departed and returned. Radios, repaired by careful hands, carried voices across distances that felt manageable again. Whatever had passed through Valenport had done so without demand, leaving behind no scar, no monument, no warning. And in that absence, life resumed its ordinary insistence on being lived. For Ethan, the mission remained with him in a way few others had, not as a story to be told, but as a reminder that not every truth sought to be known. Some existed only to test judgment, to ask whether knowledge was always owed to those capable of uncovering it. In choosing silence, he had preserved something fragile and easily lost, the humanity of a man who had asked a question without malice, and the integrity of a city that had chosen to forget. The file would remain unchanged. The words would not soften with time. But beyond the reach of archives and protocols, something else endured. A quiet alignment between intention and outcome, a rare instance where nothing needed to be fixed because nothing had been broken. The story ended not with resolution, but with continuation, not with triumph, but with balance. In Valenport and in the life of one man who had learned when to look away, everything continued to move.